This video is a summary of the life and ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, key thinker number 1 in paper 3, Political Ideas, Optional Ideology, Nationalism. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a philosopher, born in Geneva in 1712, died 1778. He is considered by many to be one of the key thinkers that inspired the French Revolution. Rousseau has quite the traumatic childhood. His mother died 9 days after giving birth to him, and when his father remarried at the age of 10, he saw little of his father. And that certainly affects his relationships in his personal life as an adult. He gives up his children for adoption and later goes on to regret that. But many of his personal relationships, both romantic and friendships, are fraught with difficulty, and many consider that to be a result of his upbringing. Geneva at the time was a city-state and a haven for the Protestant faith. And Rousseau, although brought up in that faith, converts to Catholicism, which means he has to surrender his Genevan citizenship. But he later reconverts when he returns to Geneva in 1754. He spent some time in France in between his stays in Geneva, and in his works managed to enrage both the Catholic and the Protestant churches, when he argued that all religions are equally worthy and therefore a person should simply conform to the religion that they'd been brought up in. This leads to his books being burned and arrest warrants issued in his name. In 1766, he moves to London with his friend and fellow philosopher David Hume. They would later fall out over a practical joke that Hume had knowledge of, that he didn't raise awareness of it to Rousseau, and goes back to France in 1767, settles back in Paris in 1770. But Rousseau lives a rather nomadic life, and part of that is down to the arrest warrants in his name. And he relies upon the charity of other individuals who welcome and invite him to stay with them. One thing you'll find for the optional ideology is a slightly different focus. Because you only do an essay question, you're less likely to need to have that in-depth understanding of things like views on the economy, the state, etc. I'm still going to go through that in this video because I think it gives you a good grounding into the beliefs of the key individuals. But what's also important is to look at what type of nationalist they are, which I'll do on the next slide. So let's have a look very briefly at what Jean-Jacques Rousseau has to say about human nature. I want to start off with 3 quotes. First of all, uncorrupted morals, end quote, exist in the state of nature. He bases his political thinking on the work of Thomas Hobbes, but rejects his pessimistic view of our human nature. He believes that we have uncorrupted morals. Second quote, men are wicked, but man is good. Making the distinction there between the actions of human beings and our nature. He believes that mankind is good, but people are wicked and can do wicked things. And then finally, the fruits of the earth belong to us all, and the earth itself to nobody. We'll talk about his views on private property when we get to the economy later on. For Jean-Jacques Rousseau, human beings and animals share 2 natural traits. The first one is our self-preservation instinct, and the second one is our empathy for our fellow species. So to make comparisons to the other ideologies, that self-preservation seems to link with a Hobbesian or conservative view of human nature. Empathy for our fellow species tends to move into liberal thinking. And so for him, they were our 2 natural traits that we share. There is another trait that he identifies, which is vanity. But he believed that it was only a morally deprived person that would care about their status compared to others. Rousseau believes that All humans have this natural capacity and desire for self-improvement. That originally were born as a species, as savages, we become codependent upon one another as human beings become less reliant on nature to survive. And that's when society develops, and I'll talk about that in a little while. Finally, I want to finish with one further quote, one for which Rousseau is best known. And the quote is, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." And this is linked to the state, and we'll come to it in a moment. But basically, for Rousseau, human beings need to break those negative traditions and those hierarchies that dominate society in order for our human nature to flourish. Now, that's sounding a little bit like the ideas of socialism, when we've seen that word, chains and this vision of enslavement. That sounds a little bit like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto. But Rousseau's making a very different point here. And that is the idea that when we are born as what Rousseau calls savages, we are at our most free. But with time and with developments, and particularly development of private property, we become codependent on one another. That leads to dependency. That leads to this idea of man being in chains. I'll talk very briefly now about society before we move on to his view of the state. And for Rousseau, his idea of this loss of freedom that human beings experience in society is down to the invention of private property, which again links us to economy. But that economic inequality causes conflict. And again, we're starting to see some ideas that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels will take much, much further. They're going to argue that society is defined by that conflict. I think what Rousseau is doing here is just identifying that relationship between inequality and conflict. He's not going anywhere near as far as Marx and Engels did roughly 100 years later when they wrote the Communist Manifesto. So we move on now to the state. And for many people, Jean-Jacques Rousseau is an early proponent of direct democracy. He argues in favour of what we call classical republicanism, and a republican form of government, a government without a monarch, is the best way to regain human freedom. And Rousseau is one of the inspirations behind the revolutionary thinkers in France who bring about republican government once the monarchy has been abolished. For Rousseau, in the state of nature, there is no law or morality, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's as negative a place as Thomas Hobbes had suggested. The state, therefore, is one that should uphold that law and morality that has developed over time, and society would only and should only submit to a state when its actions are in the good of the general will. And he compares the general will to the singular will of a monarch. The general will is this collective mindset of the people. Now, for Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the ideal state was a city-state like Geneva, a smaller community of people where shared ideas, this so-called general will, was more applicable. Actually, Rousseau thought that it would be very difficult to have a self-governing community in a nation the size of France. France was simply too big. There was too many communities, too many people with which to give a clear vision for the general will. But that didn't stop those revolutionaries from adapting Rousseau's ideas when the revolution came in France at the end of the 18th century. And finally, the economy. Now, historians have looked back at Rousseau's thinking and advice and writings on the economy and have come to very different conclusions. Some people have argued that actually what he says later in life contradicts some of his earlier comments. But as a general rule, Rousseau believes that commerce should be regulated in the interests of the people, and that trade and finance could be tamed to serve the health of the republic And so what we see there is some advocation of state intervention in the name of the general will. So let's summarise Jean-Jacques Rousseau's nationalism. His nationalism is democratic, it is civic, and it is forward-looking. He believes that the old bonds that have held society back, those old traditions, should be broken with. And that is the key idea that inspired the French Revolution. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's state was a self-governing community. And in some cases that was seen as an advocation of direct democracy. But what he also advocates for is magistrates who would be appointed by the people to rule on their behalf, almost like a delegate. To impose the general will. And remember that the general will, this idea that a group of people shared language and history, provides a better understanding of what the state should look like and what the state should do in the name of the people that it rules over. And the general will was always preferable to the singular will of a monarch. Jean-Jacques Rousseau famously rejected a pension from King Louis XV of France, and became known in France as the man the first man to do so, to turn down a lifetime's pension from the king. Now we've got a problem with the general will, and that is that if somebody does not fit into this image of what the majority stand for, how do they fit into that nation state? If you define what the general will is, and there are people within your nation that do not fit the general will, how do they fit into that nation state? How are they able to have their freedoms exercised? So if we were to apply it in this case, let's look at Geneva. If you took the people of Geneva in a direct democracy and asked them about what is the general will of the people when it comes to religion, well, it would very much dominate in terms of the Protestant faith. But what about other faiths or people who are sceptical or don't have any faith at all? How are they going to fit into a nation if it's decided that the general will is that of the Protestant faith? And in reality, some awful things have been done in the name of the general will. You only need to look at fascist Italy, Mao's China, Hitler's Germany, to see the unspeakable things that are done to groups of people in the name of the general will. And so governments, particularly totalitarian and tyrannical governments, have sought to define the general will in very narrow terms, and have used that in order to do unspeakable things to its own people. The final note I want to make about Jean-Jacques Rousseau's nationalism is, for him, the civic rights of the people of the nation state are more important than their cultural heritage. And that will be something of importance and of note when we move on to later key thinkers who are keen to stress the importance of cultural heritage.